A new beginning. Marcus adjusted the strap of his backpack and exhaled slowly as he stood before the grand, silent house. It loomed before him, all dark brick and ivy-covered walls, as if frozen in time. He had heard stories about the place, whispers from neighbors that the woman inside was a shadow of who she used to be. Some said she never left the house. Others claimed she barely spoke. But Marcus wasn't one to listen to gossip. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and knocked firmly on the door. A long pause followed, the kind that made seconds feel like minutes. Just as Marcus was about to knock again, a muffled voice from within reached his ears. "It's open. Come in." Marcus hesitated for a moment before twisting the doorknob and stepping inside. The entryway was dim, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and faint traces of lavender. His shoes creaked against the hardwood floor as he took in the surroundings. A home once grand, but now cloaked in neglect. Dust clung to the antique furniture, the heavy drapes blocked out most of the light, and an eerie silence pressed against his ears. A voice cut through the silence, sharp and unwelcoming. "I'm in here." Following the sound, Marcus entered a spacious living room. Sunlight filtered through a small gap in the curtains, casting a soft glow over the woman in the wheelchair by the window. Elizabeth. She was older than he had expected, maybe in her late 40s, her once blonde hair streaked with silver. Her posture was rigid, her expression hard. But it was her eyes that caught Marcus off guard. They were sharp, intelligent, filled with something just short of defiance. She studied him, lips pressed into a thin line. "You're the new one, I assume." Marcus gave a small, reassuring smile. "I'm Marcus. It's nice to meet you." Elizabeth didn't return the sentiment. "I don't need a caregiver." Marcus had expected resistance. Most people in her position resented being cared for. But he also knew that behind the harsh words was something deeper: pain, frustration, maybe even fear. "I understand," he said gently, "but I'm here to make things easier." Elizabeth scoffed. "Easier?" Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion beneath. "Nothing about this is easy, and having a stranger in my home won't change that." Marcus remained steady, his voice calm. "I'm not here to fix you, Elizabeth. I'm here to support you, in whatever way you need." Silence stretched between them. Elizabeth turned toward the window, her fingers gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. "What I need," she muttered, "is to be left alone." Marcus didn't argue. Instead, he turned and quietly made his way to the kitchen. The first days, the kitchen was as neglected as the rest of the house. The fridge held little beyond expired condiments and half-empty milk cartons. Marcus sighed softly, his heart heavy with the realization that Elizabeth hadn't been taking care of herself. "I'll need to do some grocery shopping," he murmured to himself. With what little he could find, he prepared a simple meal: scrambled eggs on toast, a small cup of tea. He added a finishing touch: a single daisy in a tiny glass jar, plucked from the garden outside. When he returned to the living room, Elizabeth hadn't moved. He set the tray beside her. "I made you breakfast." Elizabeth glanced at the food, then back at the window. "I'm not hungry." Marcus didn't push. "That's okay. It'll be here if you change your mind." Over the next few days, Marcus fell into a rhythm. He arrived early, tidied the house, prepared meals, and tried, unsuccessfully, to engage Elizabeth in conversation. She remained distant, refusing his help whenever possible. But Marcus noticed the small things: the way her eyes lingered on the breakfast tray when she thought he wasn't looking, the slight way her shoulders relaxed when he hummed softly while working. One afternoon, as he dusted a bookshelf, his eyes landed on a small box in the corner. Inside were tubes of paint, brushes, and sketchbooks, all untouched. He turned to Elizabeth. "Do you paint?" For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. "I used to." Marcus hesitated before saying, "You still can." Elizabeth scoffed. "Not that it matters." He didn't argue. Instead, he returned to dusting. Breaking the ice. Marcus noticed the overgrown garden on his first day, but he hadn't mentioned it. Now, after several weeks, he decided to bring it up. "It looks like it used to be beautiful," he said as he set down Elizabeth's lunch one afternoon. Elizabeth's eyes darted to the window, then away just as quickly. "It was," she murmured. "Did you take care of it yourself?" A small, ghostly smile played on her lips. "Every day." Then, as if catching herself, her expression hardened again. "Not that it matters anymore." Marcus leaned forward, his tone warm. "I could help you bring it back." Her fingers tightened around the armrests. "What's the point? I can't do it myself. It's better to just let it go." Marcus considered his words carefully. "But you still love it, don't you?" Silence. Then, ever so softly, Elizabeth whispered, "Yes." He didn't push further. Instead, he began doing small things. Bringing fresh flowers from the market, leaving gardening magazines on the coffee table, casually mentioning the weather and how it might be good for planting. Days passed. Then one morning, as he watered the plants in the window, Elizabeth cleared her throat. "Marcus." He turned. "If you're still interested," she said hesitantly, "maybe we could try working on the garden together." Marcus smiled. "I'd love that." They started that afternoon. As Marcus pulled weeds and cleared away dead leaves, Elizabeth began to open up. She told him about the roses she used to plant, the afternoon she spent under the oak tree, the garden party she hosted. She laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. And Marcus knew, in that moment, that something was beginning to change. The healing garden. The garden smelled of damp earth and forgotten memories. Elizabeth sat in her wheelchair at the edge of the flower beds, her sharp eyes scanning the weeds that had overtaken the once pristine space. Marcus knelt beside her, rolling up the sleeves of his work shirt, a small trowel in hand. "You really used to do all this on your own?" he asked, tugging at a stubborn vine that had wrapped itself around the wooden trellis. Elizabeth nodded, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "Every morning, rain or shine. I loved the quiet, the way the soil felt between my fingers." She hesitated, then added in a quieter tone, "It was the only place where I felt truly in control." Marcus stilled at her words. He had spent enough time with her now to know that control was something Elizabeth desperately missed. The accident had taken away her ability to walk, but more than that, it had stripped her of independence. The garden, it seemed, had once been a sanctuary, a place where she commanded life to bloom with her own two hands. "Then let's bring it back," Marcus said, determination in his voice. Elizabeth sighed. "It's too much work." Marcus wiped sweat from his brow. "Good thing you have me then." She watched as he bent back down, his hands deftly working through the weeds. He moved with the ease of someone who had done this before. "You know what you're doing," she noted. He chuckled. "My grandmother had a garden. Taught me everything I know." Elizabeth's lips twitched. "Tell me about her." Marcus sat back on his heels. "She was the strongest woman I ever knew. Raised me and my sister after my parents passed. She had this tiny plot behind her house, but you'd think it was the Garden of Eden the way she took care of it. She used to say that plants are like people. Treat them with patience and care, and they'll flourish." Elizabeth traced the rim of the wheelchair's armrest. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Marcus smiled softly, then turned back to his work. "And she always said that a garden isn't just about the plants. It's about healing." Elizabeth's fingers tightened. Healing. That word felt foreign to her. Old wounds, new growth. They worked in the garden every afternoon. Marcus did the heavy lifting, pulling weeds, tilling soil, and replacing broken trellises. Elizabeth, from her chair, directed him with expert precision. "Move the lavender closer to the roses. The scents complement each other," she instructed. "Yes, Mom," Marcus said with a playful salute. Elizabeth smirked. "And don't overwater the tulips. They drown easily." He grinned. "You sure?" "I was gonna take a hose and flood the whole thing." She rolled her eyes. You have no respect for horticulture. I'm learning. He winked. Bit by bit, the garden began to transform. The tangled mess of weeds gave way to neat rows of colorful flowers. The forgotten vegetable patch sprouted green shoots of promise. Marcus even convinced Elizabeth to start a small seedling tray on the patio, where she could reach it. At first, she resisted. It's a waste of time. But Marcus only shrugged. Humor me. And she did. One morning, she wheeled herself onto the patio and found that the seeds had sprouted. Tiny green leaves stretched toward the sunlight. Something in her chest tightened. She brushed her fingers over them, feeling the delicate stems beneath her touch. Alive. She swallowed hard. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe there was still something left to grow. Breaking down walls. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly, Elizabeth's demeanor softened. She laughed more, spoke more. She even began asking Marcus about his life outside of caregiving. Why did you become a caregiver? She asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of pink and gold. Marcus exhaled, resting his arms on his knees. I like helping people. Elizabeth arched an eyebrow. That's a simple answer. He chuckled. All right, you got me. It's more than that. He leaned back, eyes drifting toward the darkening sky. Growing up, I saw my grandmother take care of people, not just family, but neighbors, friends, anyone who needed help. She didn't have much, but she had enough love to go around. I guess it stuck with me. Elizabeth was quiet for a long time before she said, I wish I had known someone like her. Marcus turned to her. You still can. She blinked, caught off guard by his words. You still have time, he added, to open up, to let people in. Elizabeth's hands clenched on the wheels of her chair. That's not easy. I know. Marcus nodded, but neither is giving up. Her throat tightened. She had spent so long believing she was better off alone, that no one could understand the weight of her loss. But Marcus, he didn't pity her. He didn't treat her like she was fragile. He saw her for who she was, broken pieces and all. Maybe, just maybe, she could learn to see herself that way too. The note. One evening, as Marcus packed up to leave, Elizabeth's voice stopped him. Wait. He turned. She held out a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled slightly. Marcus frowned, taking it. What's this? Elizabeth swallowed. Just read it when you get home. His heart pounded as he pocketed the note. There was something in her eyes, a vulnerability he had never seen before. He nodded. Okay. That night, alone in his small apartment, Marcus unfolded the paper. The words, written in shaky but careful handwriting, made his breath catch in his throat. Marcus, I haven't told you everything. There's something you need to know. Something that could change everything. Please, don't leave me when you find out. Elizabeth. His hands tightened around the paper. What was she hiding? And why did she think he would leave? Marcus's mind raced with possibilities, but one thing was certain. Whatever Elizabeth was about to reveal, it was something big, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The secret that could change everything. Marcus sat at the small wooden table in his apartment, the dim light from the old lamp casting shadows across the note in his hand. He had read it over and over again, trying to decipher its meaning, but the words remained the same, staring back at him like an unanswered question. I haven't told you everything. There's something you need to know, something that could change everything. Please, don't leave me when you find out. Elizabeth. His hands clenched around the paper. What could she possibly be hiding? And why did she think he would leave? Marcus had spent the last few months beside her, seeing her at her weakest, her strongest, her most vulnerable. He had watched her reclaim her life, one small step at a time. The idea that she believed he would abandon her now, it hurt more than he expected. He ran a hand over his face, releasing a slow breath. There was only one way to find out. A heavy truth. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the house earlier than usual. The air was cool, the scent of damp soil and blooming roses filling his lungs as he walked up the porch steps. He knocked. A long silence followed before he heard Elizabeth's voice. "It's open." The truck came out of nowhere. He didn't even have time to react. Her voice broke. "I remember waking up in the hospital. The doctors told me I'd never walk again. But all I could think about was him. That I was still alive, and he wasn't." Tears streamed down her face, her body trembling. "His name was Daniel, and I killed him." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. She wiped at her eyes roughly. "His family never forgave me. They blamed me. Said I should have been the one who died, not him." Her voice cracked. "And honestly, I agreed." Marcus's chest ached as he watched her unravel. The woman he had come to know, the one who had fought to reclaim her life, who had found joy in their garden, who had begun to trust again, was now sitting before him, completely undone. "That's why I pushed everyone away," Elizabeth whispered. "Why I locked myself in this house. I didn't deserve to live. I didn't deserve to be happy." Marcus's hands tightened into fists. He had known she carried pain, but he had never imagined this. Elizabeth sniffled, her hands trembling. "I understand if you want to leave now. I wouldn't blame you." Marcus stared at her, then, without a word, he reached forward and took her hand in his. Elizabeth gasped, her eyes snapping up to meet his. "I'm not leaving," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I meant what I said, Elizabeth. I'm here. No matter what." Her lip trembled. "Even after knowing what I did." Marcus squeezed her hand. "It was an accident." Elizabeth let out a bitter laugh. "Tell that to Daniel's family." Marcus's gaze softened. "Elizabeth, do you think he'd want this for you? To punish yourself for the rest of your life?" She opened her mouth, then shut it, looking away. Marcus continued. "I've seen you, Elizabeth. You fought so hard to live again. And that doesn't make you selfish. That makes you human." Elizabeth's shoulders shook. "I don't know how to let go of the guilt." Marcus exhaled. "Then let's figure it out. Together." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel. Hope. The whisper of forgiveness. That evening, Elizabeth wheeled herself into the garden, the crisp night air wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. The roses Marcus had planted were beginning to bloom, their soft pink petals reaching toward the moonlight. She inhaled deeply, closing her eyes. For the past 5 years, she had been running. From her past, from herself. She had convinced herself that she was beyond redemption, that nothing could wash away the stain of Daniel's death. But then there was Marcus, and he saw her, even when she couldn't see herself. She turned her gaze toward the small wooden bench where Marcus now sat, his head tilted back as he watched the stars. She wheeled closer. "I want to try," she murmured. Marcus turned to her, eyebrows raised. "Try what?" She swallowed. "Forgiving myself." His lips curled into the softest smile. "That's a good place to start." Elizabeth hesitated before adding, "But I don't know how." Marcus exhaled, thoughtful. "Start by giving yourself the same kindness you'd give someone else." Elizabeth let out a dry chuckle. "Easier said than done." "I know." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "But you don't have to do it alone." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment, her heart pounding. She had never let herself rely on anyone, had never dared to believe someone could stay. But Marcus had. He had stayed. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't beyond saving. She took a shaky breath and whispered, "Thank you." Marcus smiled, reaching over and gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You're worth it, Elizabeth." And somehow, for the first time in a long time, she almost believed it. Rebuilding from ruins. The weight of the past. The morning air was crisp as Marcus arrived at Elizabeth's house. He found her in the garden, her hands brushing over the newly budding flowers. The softness in her movements was a stark contrast to the turmoil that had unraveled between them the night before. Marcus knew the weight of guilt wasn't something that could be lifted overnight. It was a slow, grueling process, one he had witnessed in others, but never this close, never this personal. "You're here early," Elizabeth said, her voice lighter than usual. Marcus sat beside her on the patio steps. "Couldn't sleep." She smirked. "Me neither." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that meant understanding. "Marcus," she finally said, staring at the freshly tilled soil, "you asked me last night if Daniel would want me to punish myself like this." Marcus nodded, waiting for her to continue. She exhaled, her fingers tracing the rough surface of the wheelchair armrest. "The truth is, I don't know." A small, sad smile ghosted her lips. "But I do know he loved this garden. He used to tease me about how obsessed I was with my roses. He'd say I treated them better than I treated him." Marcus chuckled. Sounds like he had a good sense of humor. "He did," she murmured. "And he wouldn't want them to die." The words were quiet, almost like she was speaking more to herself than to him. But Marcus saw it. A tiny shift, a crack in the thick wall of grief she had built around herself. "Then let's make sure they don't," Marcus said. She turned to him, something vulnerable and open in her gaze. "With your help?" Marcus grinned. "Always." Facing the shadows. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, the garden continued to flourish, just like Elizabeth. She was still quiet at times, still lost in thought, but the darkness that once seemed to consume her now had cracks of light breaking through. She was speaking more, sharing small pieces of herself in ways Marcus knew took immense effort. But with healing came confrontation. One afternoon, while Marcus was setting up new garden stakes, Elizabeth wheeled herself toward him with an envelope in her hands. It was old, the edges worn, as if it had been opened and closed 100 times. "What's that?" he asked. Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly as she held it out. "A letter from Daniel's sister." Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans before taking it. He read over the first few lines, his brows furrowing. It wasn't hate-filled. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea. "Elizabeth, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. I was angry for so long. Losing Daniel broke something in me. But after years of carrying this rage, I realized I wasn't just punishing you. I was punishing myself too. He loved you, Liz. And I think, wherever he is, he wouldn't want me to hold on to this bitterness anymore. I don't know if you can ever forgive me for how I treated you after the accident. But if you ever want to talk, I'm ready to listen." Marcus looked up, stunned. "You never responded," he asked. Elizabeth shook her head, looking away. "I couldn't." "Why?" She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because, what if she takes it back? What if she decides she still hates me?" Marcus sighed. "And what if she doesn't?" Elizabeth bit her lip, looking unsure. Marcus crouched in front of her, resting a hand on. Marcus frowned, following after her. "Elizabeth." She went straight to her desk, pulling out a checkbook. Marcus's stomach dropped. "No." Elizabeth ignored him, writing quickly before ripping the check free and holding it out. Marcus didn't take it. "I can't accept that," he said firmly. Elizabeth's jaw clenched. "You've done so much for me. You saved me, Marcus. Let me do this for you." He shook his head. "That's not why I'm here." Elizabeth's eyes burned with frustration. "I know that, but you are here, and you need help. So take the damn check." Marcus swallowed hard, torn. But Elizabeth wasn't backing down. And deep down, Marcus knew that sometimes accepting help didn't mean weakness. It meant trust. Slowly, he reached out and took the check. "Thank you," he said, voice thick. Elizabeth nodded, her throat tight. They didn't speak after that. But as they sat in the quiet house, the air between them filled with something unspoken, Something stronger than gratitude. Something closer to love. A turning point. As Elizabeth lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, she thought about everything that had happened. The garden. The letter from Daniel's sister, Marcus. And for the first time in 5 years, she felt alive. She had spent so long believing she was beyond saving, that she was undeserving of joy, of kindness, of love. But Marcus had shown her otherwise. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to believe it too. She reached for the letter beside her bed, tracing the words with her fingers. Tomorrow, she would write back. Because if Marcus had taught her anything, it was that healing didn't happen alone. It happened together. A letter unsent. Elizabeth sat at her desk long after Marcus had left for the night, the dim glow of a desk lamp casting shadows across the letter that lay before her. The same letter she had received from Daniel's sister months ago, the one she had been too afraid to answer. She traced her fingers over the paper, rereading the words for what felt like the 1,000th time. I don't know if you can ever forgive me for how I treated you after the accident, but if you ever want to talk, I'm ready to listen. Her fingers clenched. A part of her wanted to rip the letter apart, to pretend it had never arrived. But another part, a part that had been growing louder since Marcus entered her life, whispered that maybe this was her chance to stop running, her chance to heal. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and picked up a pen. And she began to write. A community's gaze. The next morning, Marcus wheeled Elizabeth through the park. It was a sunny day, and for the first time in years, she actually wanted to be outside. Children laughed in the distance, dogs barked excitedly, and joggers passed by, their feet hitting the pavement in rhythmic beats. For a moment, she felt normal, until she noticed the stairs. A group of elderly women sat on a bench, whispering and casting disapproving glances in their direction. Elizabeth frowned. Why are they looking at us like that? Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. Because some people don't like what they don't understand. Elizabeth followed their gaze, and it didn't take her long to realize why they were staring. It wasn't just that she was in a wheelchair. It was him, Marcus, a black man, pushing her wheelchair. She swallowed hard, anger bubbling in her chest. "Does this happen often?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Marcus gave a half smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "More than you'd think." Elizabeth turned to fully face him. "And you never said anything." He shrugged. "You've had enough to deal with." Elizabeth's hands curled into fists. "That doesn't make it okay." "I know." Silence stretched between them before Marcus exhaled, his hands tightening slightly on the wheelchair handles. "But I also know that what we have, our friendship, this, whatever this is more important than a few judgmental stares." Elizabeth's heart clenched. It wasn't fair. Marcus had done everything for her, had been there in ways no one else had. And yet, the world still saw him through a lens of prejudice. She wouldn't stand for it. Or rather, she wouldn't sit for it. "We should keep going," she finally said, her voice steady. "I want to enjoy this day." Marcus smiled, really smiled, and pushed her forward. And Elizabeth held her head a little higher. The unexpected visitor. Later that afternoon, as Marcus helped Elizabeth transfer from her wheelchair to the living room couch, the doorbell rang. Elizabeth frowned. "Are you expecting someone?" Marcus shook his head. He crossed the room and opened the door, only to freeze in place. Standing there, clutching a small bag in her hands, was a woman Elizabeth hadn't seen in 5 years. Her sister, Sarah. Elizabeth's breath hitched. Marcus stepped aside slowly, glancing between them. Sarah looked hesitant, her eyes darting between Marcus and her sister. "Liz," she breathed. "Can I come in?" Elizabeth couldn't speak. Her heart pounded. She wasn't ready. But when she looked over at Marcus, his warm, steady presence grounding her, she knew she never would be. So she took a shaky breath, and she nodded. Sarah stepped inside, the air thick with years of unresolved pain. Marcus quietly excused himself, moving into the kitchen to give them space. But even as he left, Elizabeth felt his presence. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to face the past. Buried words, unspoken pain. The silence stretched between the sisters, heavy and suffocating. Sarah shifted awkwardly in her seat. "You look good," she finally said. Elizabeth let out a dry laugh. "I look the same." Sarah swallowed hard. "Liz, why now?" Elizabeth interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. Sarah's hands twisted together. "Because I should have come sooner." Elizabeth let out a slow breath, trying to keep the storm of emotions at bay. Sarah hesitated before continuing. "After your accident, I didn't know how to be around you. You were so angry, and I didn't know how to help." Elizabeth scoffed. "So you left?" Sarah's eyes filled with guilt. "I was a coward." A long silence followed. Elizabeth studied her sister, the woman who had abandoned her when she needed her most, the woman who had once been her best friend. And she realized something. She wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way she used to be. She was hurt. And maybe that hurt would never fully go away. But it didn't mean she couldn't try. "You should have stayed," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah's eyes shone with tears. "I know." Elizabeth swallowed thickly. "But you're here now." Sarah nodded. "I am." Elizabeth exhaled. Then, after a long pause, she reached out, her fingers barely brushing Sarah's. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. An unbreakable bond. As Sarah left later that evening, Marcus stepped back into the living room, his gaze gentle. "You okay?" he asked. Elizabeth stared at the door for a long moment before nodding. "I think so." Marcus smiled softly. "Good." She turned to him. "You knew I needed to do this, didn't you?" He shrugged. "Maybe." Elizabeth sighed, shaking her head. "You always act like you don't know everything, but you do." Marcus chuckled. "I just know you." Elizabeth's chest tightened. She looked at Marcus, the man who had become her greatest friend, the one who had stood by her when everyone else had walked away. And she knew, without a doubt, that he was the reason she was standing, emotionally, if not physically, stronger than before. "Thank you," she whispered. Marcus smiled, reaching out to squeeze her hand. Always. A future unwritten. As the days passed, Elizabeth felt lighter. The letter to Daniel's sister was sent. Her relationship with Sarah was slowly mending. And her bond with Marcus deepened. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Elizabeth looked at him and whispered, "I think I'm ready to fight for my future." Marcus turned to her, eyes filled with warmth. "Then let's fight together." Elizabeth smiled. For the first time in 5 years, she felt alive. And she knew, with Marcus by her side, she always would be. The fight for the future. The letter that changed everything. The morning air was crisp, and the scent of blooming roses filled the garden as Elizabeth wheeled herself to the patio table. She felt lighter today, not completely free from the weight of the past, but lighter. Marcus had been right. Confronting her sister, facing Daniel's memory, and sending that letter had been a turning point. Now she was waiting for an answer. She glanced at the mailbox near the front gate, her stomach twisting with anticipation. It had been nearly a week since she mailed her letter to Daniel's sister, and every morning, Marcus brought in the mail with a knowing glance. Today was no different. As he walked up the path, holding a stack of envelopes, she immediately spotted it, a pale blue envelope with familiar handwriting. Marcus saw her reaction and wordlessly handed it to her before taking the seat across from her. Elizabeth hesitated. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface, feeling the weight of what lay inside. "You don't have to open it now," Marcus said softly, always giving her space. But she shook her head. "I need to." With trembling fingers, she tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. She read, then read again. And when she finally exhaled, tears pooled in her eyes. Elizabeth, I never thought I'd hear from you. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't think you'd ever forgive me for how I treated you after Daniel's death. I was drowning in my own grief, and I let it turn to anger. I lashed out at you because I needed someone to blame. But you weren't to blame, Liz. None of us were. It was an accident, a horrible, tragic accident. I'm sorry for the years we lost. I'm sorry for not being there when you needed me most. If you're willing, I'd love to meet, to talk, to try. You were family to Daniel. That means you're still family to me. With love, Hannah. Elizabeth covered her mouth as a sob threatened to break free. Marcus reached for her hand, steady and warm. What does it say? She looked up at him, eyes shining. She wants to meet. For a moment, Marcus said nothing, just took in the emotion on her face. Then, his lips curled into a proud, soft smile. That's good, Elizabeth, he murmured. That's really good. And for the first time in years, Elizabeth let herself believe it. One step closer. 2 days later, Elizabeth sat in the therapy center, gripping the parallel bars with both hands. The sweat on her brow dripped down her temples, and her arms shook from effort. Marcus stood in front of her, hands hovering near her waist, ready to catch her if she wobbled. You got this, Elizabeth, he said, his voice full of confidence. One step at a time. Elizabeth's therapist, Sarah, stood to the side, clipboard in hand. All right, Elizabeth, just like we practiced. Elizabeth took a deep breath. Then she moved her right foot. Her left followed. One step, then another. Her breath came in sharp, focused bursts as she forced her body forward, her legs trembling under the weight they hadn't carried in 5 years. But she didn't stop. 3 steps. 4. Then her knee buckled. Marcus caught her instantly, his arms strong around her waist, keeping her upright. I got you, he murmured. Elizabeth let out a shaky laugh. I almost made it to you. Marcus grinned. Almost. But next time, you will. Sarah nodded in agreement. You're making incredible progress, Elizabeth. Keep this up, and we'll have you walking short distances in no time. Elizabeth exhaled, sinking back into her wheelchair, her muscles burning, but her heart soaring. She could do this, and for the first time since her accident, she wanted to. A new beginning, an unexpected goodbye. Later that evening, Marcus sat across from Elizabeth at the kitchen table, stirring a cup of tea. There was something off about him. He was quieter than usual, more reserved. Elizabeth studied him for a long moment before speaking. What's wrong? Marcus hesitated. Then, after a beat of silence, he sighed and set his mug down. I got a call today. Elizabeth's stomach tightened. From who? Marcus rubbed his temples, looking suddenly exhausted. A job offer. Elizabeth's breath caught. He continued, it's in another city. A care facility, one that actually values its workers. Better pay, better resources. It's an incredible opportunity. Elizabeth felt her heart plummet. Oh. Silence. Long. Heavy. You should take it, she finally said, forcing a smile. Marcus searched her face, reading her too easily. Elizabeth. You deserve it, she interrupted, cutting him off before he could say something she wasn't ready to hear. You've done so much for me. You need to do this for yourself. His eyes softened. That doesn't mean I want to leave you. Elizabeth swallowed hard. I know. She did know. And that was the hardest part. Because she wanted him to stay. More than anything. But she wouldn't hold him back. I'll be okay, she whispered. Marcus exhaled sharply, looking like he wanted to argue. But instead, he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. No matter where I go, you're always going to be a part of my life, Elizabeth. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she blinked them away. I know. And she did. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. The last goodbye. For now. The day Marcus left, Elizabeth wheeled herself to the front porch, watching as he packed the last of his things into his car. He turned, rubbing the back of his neck. "So, I guess this is it." Elizabeth forced a smirk. "Not unless you're planning to never call." Marcus laughed. "Not a chance." A breeze swept through the yard, carrying the scent of fresh soil and blooming roses. Their garden. Their memories. Marcus walked up to her, kneeling beside her chair. His gaze was soft, warm, filled with something unspoken. "Keep walking," he murmured. Elizabeth swallowed hard, nodding. "I will." Marcus reached for her hand one last time, squeezing it gently. And then he was gone. Elizabeth sat there long after his car disappeared down the road. She had lost people before. She had watched them walk away. But for the first time, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like a beginning. Because this time, she wasn't alone. And she wasn't broken. She was healing. One step at a time. Walking into tomorrow. A life without Marcus. The silence in the house was deafening. Elizabeth had never realized how much space Marcus had filled, not just in her home, but in her life. The mornings weren't the same without the sound of his voice humming in the kitchen. The afternoons felt empty without their conversations in the garden. The evenings were lonelier without his presence beside her, his quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone. For the first time in months, she was truly by herself, and it terrified her. She had depended on him, not just for care, but for comfort, for the strength he had given her when she hadn't been able to find it in herself. But he was gone now. And this time, there was no one left to hold her up, which meant she had no choice. She would have to stand on her own. Letters from afar. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus left. Elizabeth hadn't expected him to call so often, but he did. And when he didn't call, he wrote. She ran her fingers over the latest letter, neatly folded on the kitchen table. His handwriting was careful, deliberate, each word carrying a piece of him. "Elizabeth, I miss our garden. The one here isn't the same. They don't let us plant whatever we want. Too many regulations, but I still go out there when I can. It reminds me of you. How's therapy going? Have you made it to 5 steps yet? I know you have. I hope you're still pushing forward. You're stronger than you think. I knew that from the moment I met you. Take care of yourself. And don't forget to send me an update. I want to hear about everything, even the boring stuff. Marcus." Elizabeth exhaled, setting the letter down. She had never had someone choose to stay in her life before. Not like this. Even from miles away, Marcus was still here. And because of that, she wouldn't let herself fall back into the woman she had been before. She wouldn't let his faith in her go to waste. A meeting years in the making. A week later, Elizabeth found herself in a cafe downtown, fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea. She hadn't been here in years, and she had never expected to be meeting Hannah, Daniel's sister. Her palms were sweaty, her heart pounded in her chest. She had imagined this meeting 1,000 times. The anger, the accusations, the weight of Daniel's memory pressing down between them. But when Hannah walked in, none of that happened. Instead, her eyes softened and she smiled. Not forced, not bitter, just gentle. Elizabeth exhaled slowly. "Hi." Hannah sat down across from her. "Hi, Liz." They stared at each other for a moment, the silence stretching between them. Then, Hannah let out a shaky breath. "I don't really know what to say." Elizabeth swallowed. "Me neither." A small chuckle escaped Hannah's lips. "Great, 2 people meeting for the first time again, and neither of them can talk." Elizabeth smiled, despite herself. Sounds about right. They sat there, uncertain but willing. And that was enough. A milestone in the making. Elizabeth's therapist, Sarah, watched with a cautious smile as she positioned herself in front of the parallel bars. "We're going to try something new today," Sarah said. "No Marcus to catch you this time. Just you. And me watching. Elizabeth took a deep breath. She knew this day would come. The day she would have to take those steps alone. Marcus had been her safety net. He had been there every time she had stumbled. Every time she had nearly fallen. But not anymore. This time, it was just her. She tightened her grip on the bars, her knuckles whitening. One breath. One shift of her weight. And then, one step. Then another. And another. 5, 6, 7 steps. Her legs trembled beneath her. Her arms shook, but she kept going until she couldn't. Her knees buckled, but she didn't fall. She grabbed onto the bars and steadied herself. She let out a breathless laugh. I did it. Sarah grinned. Yes, you did. Elizabeth's heart pounded, not from fear, but from something else. Something Marcus had always told her she had. Strength. A promise kept. That night, Elizabeth sat at her desk and wrote, Marcus, today I walked 7 steps, alone, and I didn't fall. You were right. I'm stronger than I think. I miss you. I miss our garden. I miss having you here. But I know you're where you need to be. And I think I'm where I need to be too. Thank you for everything. Come visit soon. The roses are starting to bloom again. Elizabeth. She folded the letter and sealed it, setting it on the table to be mailed in the morning. Then she wheeled herself to the patio. The night air was crisp. The garden smelled alive. For the first time in years, she felt like she was standing on solid ground, even if she was still in her wheelchair. She wasn't waiting for someone to save her anymore. She had saved herself, and when Marcus finally came back to visit, she would walk to meet him. The final step forward. 2 months later, Elizabeth stood at the entrance of the garden, her hands resting on the handles of a walker. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her heart race. The door opened, and there he was, Marcus. His eyes widened as he took in the sight before him. Elizabeth, standing. His breath hitched. Elizabeth. She smiled. And then she took a step. Toward him. 1 step. Then another. Until she stood just a few feet away from him. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the past. Not the pain. Just this. Just them. And as she met Marcus's tear-filled eyes, she whispered the words she had waited so long to say. I told you I'd walk to meet you. Marcus laughed, choked with emotion, shaking his head. Yeah, you did. And then, without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms. Elizabeth clung to him, her heart racing, her body shaking. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from finally, truly, living again. And as they stood there, in the garden they had rebuilt together, Elizabeth realized one simple truth. She wasn't just walking. She was free. Finally, completely free.